and I'm going to ask Chair Gunda to come give us an overview of where we're headed with the state and the load flexibility activities in California. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry, I just dropped a bunch of coffee on myself, trying to clap for Matt. So Matt, so this is what I got. So I'm going to hide behind the podium here to not have you focus there, not on my pants. So with that, just before I jump into the slides, I want to take a moment to just congratulate LBNL and the diverse group of people in this room. Many of you are friends. Over the years, I see Jessica there, see Akriti and David there. So just, a lot of work. I've had a chance to work with Marco, who was sitting there for a second. So I appreciate this group of people who have not only done incredible work over the last 5 years, but for decades kept the discussion around demand flexibility at the center of California's policy and the importance of that. So I just want to thank all of you. And I know that this is one of the last events, but we hope to figure out ways to continue to work together. So before I go to the next slide, also wanted to just share, again, this group is pretty wonky, all the pieces. I think what I will try to do is just connect where we are in terms of policy and law, and how do we kind of continue to move with momentum on demand flexibility. So 30,000 foot level, a couple of pieces for us to think about. So the peak load on the system today in California is about 60 gigs, right? So that's going to go, that's 2026. You have CAISO almost 45 to 48, and then depending the rest of it, it's the rest of the POUs in the state. And we expect that load to go to 80 by 2040, and it could be higher. So I see Sarah too. Hi, Sarah. So the importance for us to think about is where is that demand growth coming from? Much of that is electrification, and much of that is these new kind of sectors like data centers. So we will be using a lot of electrons. So we are in this moment where we kind of had this flat load for almost like 10 years, because the incremental demand that's coming on the system was compensated by behind the meter solar. So now we have the peak moving from middle of the day to more at 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m., and the load's now going to continue to grow up. So that's one. So the second point I want to make sure is right now the coincidental peak load for California is about 8 p.m. or 7. I think it's at 6 today in September. But when you look at the demand going up in February, that is going to meet essentially the second peak. The winter and summer peak will be the same by 2045. So just wanted to flag those pieces for us to think about how demand flexibility is going to play a very important role. The last point before I go into the slide is thinking about the investments that we need. So when we look at the demand forecasting, demand scenarios, and stitching that to the SB 100, which is our clean energy goals on the generation side, you're looking at adding another 3 million acres of new generation in California, right? So we're right now a 100 gig system. Depending on how the demand plays out and how we procure for the demand, the system could be as big as 300 gigawatts by 2045. So when we talk about that 300 gigawatts, that 300 gigawatts has to be on a piece of land. It has to have transmission. It has to have distribution. So when you think about adding all those costs, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. So it's very clear to policymakers, regulators, and legislators that the opportunity for demand flexibility is humongous. So the task for us from now on here is how do we make sure we, as the demand starts going up again on the system, really bring demand flexibility as a core product to reduce affordability, improve safety, and reliability of the system. So I'll go to the next slide. So I think it's always nice to just start with kind of thinking about how we evolved and a couple of core elements. So if you go back a couple decades, I was grad student, joining PG&E in the energy efficiency program, super excited about energy efficiency and DR. There was a very clear agreement that energy efficiency and demand response was a no-brainer. We had a loading order, and we always tried to start the system planning with energy efficiency and DR. Now, as we move towards the current space, a number of things have happened, whether we're thinking about the implementation of DRAM, whether we're thinking about the bifurcation in 2014, and just thinking about the bifurcation, what CPUC was trying to solve through bifurcation was essentially what we're trying to solve today, which is reduce double counting, making sure that there is reliability on the supply side versus demand side. So for those of you who track this every day, the bifurcation was really about saying there are demand side resources and there are supply side resources, and let's kind of count them differently. And as we move forward, whether it's LIP protocol, LMS, these are tools to evaluate demand response better and then facilitate the penetration of demand response better. So now, as we go into the 2023, which I'll talk about, again, a big thanks to LBNL, because much of the 7 gigawatt goal was based on LBNL's potential study. So as we were looking into what is the art of the possible in California, it was very clear that as a state, we had about 7 gigs of potential for demand flexibility. Let's think about it for a second just on EVs. If you think about EVs, the total amount of EV charging load by 2030 could exceed 7 gigs. Right. So, it depends on how you do it. Right now we have a really good, planning on how to charge them. But if you have unmanaged charging, just with EVs, it's a significant amount of gigawatts. So the opportunity is there. It's about how do you capture that in a meaningful way. That is, when you look at the CAISO is thinking, hey, yeah, I press a button, demand flexibility is there and it's reliable. And PUC is looking at the lens and says, you know what, this is actually cost effective for my customers. So that's the problem we are trying to solve, which is what is a unified way of talking about the value and the reliability of demand flexibility. Next slide, please. So when you think about that, let's just kind of remind ourselves as you go through this day on the key drivers on why we are trying to do demand flexibility. And I don't think this has changed much. The taxonomy has changed. The way we talk about demand flexibility has changed, but the core values have not really changed. And I think it's fundamentally recognizing that as you move from a very dispatchable generation portfolio, such as thermal power plants, to a more renewable portfolio, which is intermittent, it's really important for us to think about how do we not just align supply with demand, but demand with supply, right? So there was this really important argument that if you have dispatchable resource, I can go up and down in my total megawatts on the system and the frequency balancing. I don't really have to worry about demand. But as you have more and more renewables, which is true today, if you look at California, it's a 100 gig system, 40 of that is dispatchable, thermal system, but the other 60 is renewables. So it's important for us to think about how can demand flexibility play an important role in matching the demand to the supply. Second, as we know today, there's a lot of curtailment of renewable energy in California. And those megawatts and that energy could be utilized if we can move the demand to those hours. So whether we're talking about number 2, moving it to the clean, cheaper hours or the low carbon hours, there is an opportunity for us to actively plan to make sure demand actually lines up with the hours where you have cleaner and more affordable energy on the system. And finally, I think the bucket number 3, which is really important, to me and the CEC, especially in my role as thinking about reliability for the state, the important part here is you have about 20 to 50 hours a year that you need this massive needle peaks on the system. So you're looking at the entire year, it's like pretty flat, and there's this 20, 50 hours, you have significant load growth. And those significant load growth, you can add a bunch of generation and put it on the ratepayers, or you can think about reducing that for those 20, 50 hours. And that's where the reliability and resiliency comes in. And those are the values we see no matter what, for the last 20 years. So it's now about how do you operationalize in the modern context. Next slide. So I want to give you a little bit of what's been happening in the thinking from a regulatory and policymaking perspective. There is an inner box there, which is green, yellow. The green one was the standard way that we think about demand flexibility planning in the state. So demand forecasting that the CEC develops is an integral part of thinking about how demand flexibility flows through the system. So in the demand flexibility upfront, in the demand forecasting, what we do is we do something called load modifying. So we look at the total sales or total needs on the system. And then when you look at the total consumption, and let's start and be precise with the words, you start with the total consumption and you say, this is the amount I can remove from consumption based on energy efficiency, demand response, and so on. So that is what's called load modifying. So, and then after you remove that load modifier, you call it the managed demand. And that managed demand goes to the IRP and RA processes. So as you look through there, in the first part, you have energy efficiency, TOU rates, behind the meter storage. All of them is already baked in. And then the demand goes over to IRP and says, okay, for this net demand that's still remaining, what is the way we can use DR, right? And then that's where you have the PDR or DRAM and other products that really come in there. Currently, there is also within the RA context, you have what is called reliability DR. So you have about 1,000 megawatts of these big, bulky loads that you can suddenly drop if you get into a place where the load is really high. But what we found in 2020 when the lights went off and 2022, when we were really close to lights going off on September 6th, is we need this additional amount of demand flexibility to reduce those extraordinary hours none of our planning is currently seeing because of climate change and other aspects. So when you look at that, then we kind of, in 2020, post-2020, we really start thinking about what are those extraordinary hours beyond the regular planning that we need demand flexibility for. And that's where you had demand side grid support, emergency load reduction products and such. Next slide. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes? Okay, great. So that resulted in kind of thinking about the taxonomy for the CEC. So let me kind of really highlight this today. I know Commissioner McAllister is going to speak this afternoon, but really he's trying to lead this work at CEC, but across the agencies. What does demand flexibility actually mean when we talk about to different stakeholders? So one of the issues we see with DR, demand flexibility, VPPs, and so on, is the same words mean different things to different people. And it's really important for us to somehow standardize those words. Because what's happening is two people I see at the legislature arguing on exactly the same point with different words and everything breaks apart. So I would really put that in front of this team to really think about how do we consistently speak about what demand flexibility is, even if it means older words are not good anymore. So maybe we need to come up with new words, but let's think about that. But for CEC's perspective for today, I'm going to say there are 3 buckets, as I just mentioned previously. There's a load modifying, there's a resource adequacy bucket, and then there's an emergency and incremental bucket. So when we did the 7,000 megawatt goal, we looked at where we were in 2022, and just want to flag this for you. On the load modifying side, we have TOU rates, and obviously dynamic pricing, and some of the event-based programs that CCAs use today. They're still considered load modifying. So between that, you have about 1,000 megawatts, and then you go down to resource adequacy. This is where you have your standard PDR products, or DRAM. And then also, just want to recognize that within the resource adequacy context today, we have the reliability supply side DR, right? So that already exists there. So one of the questions we are trying to work with CPUC is, do we really want to have that there, or do we want to move it to incremental, right? So, and then finally, those incremental pieces, again, bringing it back for us just for a moment here on the technical side, when we talk about reliability, we typically talk about 1 in 10 loss of load expectation, right? So it's basically saying, I'll do a stochastic analysis and I will make sure that when my stochastically balance my supply and demand, I'm not going to have more than 1 outage in 10 years. But what we have observed in 2020 and 2022 is the events that happened that resulted in outages were way outside that 1 in 10 loss of load expectation. And so it's important for us to think about how do you plan for those incremental events that are outside of our standard practices, and how do you bucket them? And that's what the third bucket really is. Next slide. So now kind of looking at that framework and looking at a call for 7,000 megawatts, where are we today? So our CEC staff are currently updating the the kind of the requirements for the 7 gigawatt goal, and the new report is coming up soon. But business as usual today, we do not see meeting our 7,000 megawatt goal by 2030, right? There are a few things that are not baked into it right now. It's not baked into it, the dynamic rates and the opportunity of the dynamic rates. We really do not know what's going to happen with the ELRP and DSGS and other incremental programs. So once we think about them, maybe some of that will be met, but it's really hard for us to see a pathway to get to 7,000 megawatt goal. And this is where I really want to challenge ourselves in this room. Again, these are market participants, people who are at the front lines of thinking this through and thoughtfully, and thought leaders. Why is that, right? So we have a technical potential that's 7,000 megawatts. And the potential study from LBNL clearly articulated the opportunity, and there is this huge wedge on making it happen. And this is what calls for, is it a process issue? Is it an alignment issue? Is it an evaluation issue? Are we actually doing a robust analysis to represent all pieces, right? So I think this is where the unified framework is really important for us all to get on the same page so we can make meaningful progress and not work against each other in a way that the opportunity is really lost. And I want to really emphasize that for this stream. Next slide. Okay, so that then calls for, just framing this for us. We have been working with a number of different stakeholder groups, whether it's our state agencies as a team, including CAISO, whether it is universities, LBNL, UC Davis. We are working across a lot of different groups to really think about what's missing, right? So we recognize that the demand was flat. We recognize that the demand is going to grow really fast over the next 10 years. And there's an incredible opportunity to tap into that demand growth. So then what are we missing? So we broadly identify 4 pieces for us to think about. So first is, do we have, when we think about system evaluation, you look at bulk grid, you look at transmission planning, and you look at distribution planning. The demand flexibility can serve each one of them in different ways. And the question for us is, do we have a unified approach for that? So if I am going to put demand flexibility in my overall system demand and send it over to PUC for their IRP, that misses a lot of opportunity on the distribution side and the transmission side, right? I think most of you have seen the transmission, the new transmission plan that came out of CAISO last week. It's, again, tens of billions of dollars of transmission investments, right? So the question for us is there a unified way to evaluate system to transmission to distribution? And can we get on the same page on that analysis? Second, do we actually have data? Is there data asymmetry between all of us? Is there data transparency? Do we have, recognizing that privacy is an issue, never undermine that, recognizing that confidentiality is an issue, but are we actually using the power of data fully? So CEC has been, for example, sitting on the AIMI data for 5 years. And I'm holding ourselves responsible. Is like, have we made any meaningful progress in looking at that data and thinking about forecasting? The answer is mixed, right? So those are the kinds of things we really need to think about. And then more and more, there is very clear evidence that at the distribution level, there is huge opportunity, especially in congested areas, for demand flexibility. How do we unlock that through automation, right? So really thinking through the distribution value. And all that brings to, for us, we need an aligned statewide framework that we can talk about this taxonomy, talk about the framework in a unified way, and we can compete on the ideas, not on the framework. And I think if you compete on the framework and taxonomy, we are going to have multiple ways of thinking about it without achieving progress. So I just want to call that, where do we benefit from standardization? Next slide. Just highlighting where CEC continues to work on. We broadly look at 3 pieces. Again, forecasting, planning documents, some of the AMI analysis that we do, that's all in the planning bucket. CEC has an important role of pushing out money, being the granting agency on the clean energy, in a forward movement. And so R&D, clean transportation, really want to highlight clean transportation's Redwoods, which is the vehicle to grid integration pilot, so that we have a bunch of money going there. And finally, on the strategic reserve and the ideas of how to think about incrementality. And on the regulatory side, Commissioner McAllister will talk about it, and Miriam, who is a mentor. Many of you here are mentors in this room, including Sarah on the behavior side. Thank you. So we have the opportunity on the LMS, really thinking about how do you use the regulatory tools that CEC has to really move this forward. So next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so giving you all in a closing, this is the different efforts that are going on. There is a CEC, UC Davis, LBNL, obviously. This we did a summit last year. Really appreciate LBNL's participation in crafting what I would think is like a re-energizing a moment of let's think about demand flexibility from 2025 and onward, right? So that was an important moment. UC Davis has been convening a lot of conversations post that summit with different stakeholder groups, which has been really, really helpful, right? So I want to take this moment to kind of get a little bit into bridging academia, technology into regulatory and lawmaking, right? One of the core elements that we have to achieve in this moment is to build trust. We need to build trust on the opportunity. So there are different stakeholders who see the value generally, but really doubt the way we are doing demand flexibility. And it's really important for us to take the time and all the energy necessary to bring people together into a single room and really think about this as our problem rather than my or your problem. It's really important to think about it as our opportunity to solve. So I think the UC Davis convenings are going to really play an important role there. We have CPUC's long-term DR proceeding. This is a demand flexibility proceeding. Commissioner Baker is going to take that on now. Really, they're looking at like maybe 2 to 3 years of work and huge opportunity for us to all align together and make sure that proceeding lands into a good framework. And, a couple of CEC, regulatory proceedings. And then finally, for those of you following, CAISO is now thinking about those top 20, 50 hours and how to unlock. And they have their work. So all of us are unified on this opportunity and, wishing all of you luck and also really grateful for the incredible work that you've done to date. Thank you.